Donald Trump recently signed a crucial economic policy document that might transform international trade, and Britain just executed an unforeseen military deployment that experts believe indicates shifting regional dynamics. Yesterday evening, Friday, February 6, 2026, Trump authorized an executive order establishing fresh tariff policies impacting countries with particular trade arrangements. The White House issued documentation 18 hours earlier showing a substantial shift in economic approach. Based on official reports, the order introduces potential 25% import levies on nations sustaining specific commercial connections. This marks one of the most extensive trade policy transformations in modern American history. Here's what renders this especially significant. Within hours of Trump's authorization, Britain relocated 6 sophisticated aircraft from their original base to a Mediterranean position. UK Defense Journal verified this movement 5 hours earlier through accessible flight data. These aircraft, F-35B versions, recognized for their superior capabilities, flew approximately 6 hours to arrive at their fresh position. British representatives informed journalists that this deployment concerns regional circumstances rather than current operations. The scheduling implies cooperation between Washington and London on wider strategic preparation. When significant powers concurrently execute economic actions and modify military placement, markets and experts pay attention. The executive order extends beyond standard trade policy. It potentially impacts relationships with numerous major economies, including some of America's biggest trading associates. Any nation sustaining particular commercial activities now encounters possible automatic tariff execution. Consider the magnitude. Multiple countries presently participate in considerable trade volumes that might activate these fresh measures. Energy imports exclusively represent billions in yearly transactions, include manufactured items and agricultural commodities. The figures become quite remarkable. Trump's Commerce Department and State Department possess 7 days to gather relevant information. Then execution procedures commence automatically based on prearranged criteria. The process requires minimal discretionary assessment once activated. Meanwhile, diplomatic conversations persist. Foreign minister delegates have expressed their stances on different policy matters. These declarations show that negotiating positions stay quite distant apart on multiple key topics. Next week's planned meetings will examine whether mutual ground exists. Based on public declarations from all parties, considerable gaps persist regarding fundamental policy questions. The tariff actions take effect Wednesday, February 11th. That schedule provides affected entities exactly 4 days to evaluate options and potentially modify their trade arrangements. 4 days constitutes a remarkably condensed decision-making period for complex international business. Major economies are improbable to reorganize entire supply networks in such restricted time. Energy sector agreements, transportation arrangements, and financial settlements normally demand months to alter. Anticipating rapid transformations seems impractical given commercial circumstances. So, Wednesday approaches with tariff execution likely advancing as intended. Different nations will react according to their economic concerns and strategic preferences. Some might modify trade configurations. Others might acknowledge tariff expenses as acceptable given alternative factors. Economic experts are calculating different scenarios. If tariffs advance without major trading associate concessions, the policy attains a restricted immediate influence while generating longer-term tension. If particular nations do decrease specific trade arrangements, that constitutes policy achievement, but also economic intricacy. Britain's aircraft relocation introduces another aspect to these circumstances. The Mediterranean position now accommodates an expanded presence of different military platforms. Experts observe this constitutes the biggest such concentration at that installation in over a decade. Official descriptions stress defensive and protective objectives. The stated mission involves protecting existing infrastructure and regional concerns should wider situations emerge. This presentation implies contingency preparation rather than immediate activity. However, placing sophisticated capabilities in that particular position does supply different operational alternatives should circumstances transform. Military strategists rarely position high-value assets without examining multiple potential situations. Financial markets are reacting to these circumstances. Cryptocurrency valuations have dropped substantially. Bitcoin presently exchanges around $70,000 after previously achieving much elevated levels. Traditional commodities display increased instability. Equity markets exhibit nervousness about potential economic disruption. These market fluctuations reflect investor ambiguity about how trade policy transformations and military placement might impact global business and regional steadiness. When governments execute major policy modifications simultaneously across economic and security fields, markets normally respond with prudence. The next multiple days will be quite revealing. Wednesday's tariff execution constitutes a concrete deadline. Next week's diplomatic meetings present a final scheduled chance for negotiated results, and military placement continues developing in reaction to changing situations. All of these components are merging during a remarkably condensed schedule. The velocity of circumstances suggests that major choices are approaching rather than staying distant prospects. Let's analyze the specific procedures of Trump's executive order and why it generates particular economic dynamics. The order invokes long-standing emergency statements, first established in 1995 and renewed yearly since. These statements supply executive power to execute certain trade actions without demanding additional legislative permission. Under the order structure, Commerce Secretary recognizes relevant trade arrangements. State Department then creates execution methods, rates, scope, specific commodities. Presidential power makes final choices. The documentation contains important phrasing. The president might alter the order if situations transform in reaction to economic elements, or if affected entities take substantial steps to address the fundamental concerns. This phrasing shows flexibility exists theoretically. However, practical execution implies alterations, demands substantial policy modifications from affected nations. Minor modifications likely prove inadequate to activate order changes. Different countries sustain significant commercial arrangements that might fall under these fresh measures. Energy trade exclusively constitutes massive economic worth. Include other sectors, and the sums become quite considerable. China acquires approximately 1.5 million barrels daily of certain energy commodities. India imports over 500,000 barrels. Turkey's overall trade in affected divisions exceeded 5.7 billion in 2024. All these dealings now potentially encounter 25% additional expenses when those commodities enter American markets. That constitutes meaningful economic influence on businesses and governments throughout these supply networks. The inquiry becomes whether such influence generates desired policy transformations or simply generates economic tension without accomplishing strategic goals. Historical proof implies economic actions sometimes achieve success and sometimes fail, depending on countless variables. Britain's aircraft deployment happens against this economic policy setting. The 6 F-35B platforms left their original base, accompanied by 2 large refueling aircraft. Total flight duration approximately 6 hours to arrive at the Mediterranean installation. The scheduling seems intentional. Britain delayed until after Trump's authorization before launching this deployment. That arrangement implies coordinated preparation between allied governments. Independent activities normally don't correspond so accurately. The F-35B version provides specific capabilities applicable to different situations. Its short takeoff and vertical landing configuration permits operations from installations with restricted infrastructure. Sophisticated sensor arrangements supply significant information collection and distribution capabilities. Official British declarations stress protective assignments focused on protecting existing facilities. However, modern military platforms normally possess multiple operational capabilities. Defensive arrangements can often shift to other assignment profiles as situations demand. The installation's position supplies alternatives for different contingencies. Positioned within operational distance of countless regional points of concern, these platforms might support different situations, depending on how circumstances emerge. Media coverage shows the installation now holds 10 aircraft of one category, 6 of the sophisticated version, and 2 support platforms. This constitutes the most significant concentration of such capabilities at that position in many years. Beyond aircraft, there are accounts of expanded cargo transport movement. American heavy lift flights into different regional installations have expanded noticeably over recent days. Jordan, certain Gulf nations, and other positions are obtaining enhanced logistics movement. Large transport aircraft activities normally show equipment and supply placement. Such movement doesn't happen for routine objectives. It implies preparation for sustained operations or contingencies demanding substantial material assistance. Multiple specialized communication platforms have positioned to regional positions. During previous intervals of heightened movement, America had 1 such aircraft in theater. Current accounts show 3 are now positioned regionally. These communication platforms fulfill critical functions, managing complex operations across multiple positions and fields. Expanding their quantities implies preparation for more challenging operational circumstances. Financial markets continue analyzing these circumstances. The merger of economic policy execution, military placement, and diplomatic schedule compression generates unusual ambiguity. Markets generally dislike ambiguity and react through expanded instability and risk decrease. Specific dates now influence market focus. Wednesday, February 11th for tariff execution. Next week for diplomatic meetings. Mid-February time periods that experts are observing based on different indicator configurations. When concrete deadlines approach, while policy distances remain wide and military postures shift noticeably, markets rationally calculate in elevated danger. That danger calculation appears through asset worth modifications, instability spikes, and defensive placement. The approaching days will explain whether current paths persist or whether situations generate different results than current trends imply. So here's what experts anticipate during the next 2 weeks based on current signals. Next week's diplomatic meetings will examine whether negotiating positions can discover mutual ground. Public declarations from different entities show substantial distances on fundamental topics. Connecting such distances normally demands time and adaptability that current schedules may not supply. Meanwhile, Wednesday's tariff execution generates its own dynamic. Major trading nations encounter choices about whether sustaining certain commercial arrangements justifies acknowledging additional expenses on their American-bound exports. Economic examination implies most affected entities will likely persist existing trade configurations despite tariff additions. Reorganizing supply networks demands significant time and investment. Alternative origins might not exist at necessary magnitude or acceptable costs. If tariffs advance without major behavioral transformations from targeted nations, the policy attains restricted immediate influence on the specific topics it addresses. That generates political dynamics demanding further policy reactions. British military placement continues emerging. The Mediterranean installation now accommodates capabilities that supply different operational alternatives. Official declarations stress protective assignments, but capability existence itself generates alternatives regardless of expressed intentions. Israeli leadership has voiced strong perspectives on regional policy matters. Accounts show upcoming conversations between Israeli and American representatives where these subjects will obtain detailed focus. Different entities bring different outlooks on optimal methods to shared concerns. When allies have diverging choices on scheduling and approaches for addressing mutual challenges that generates diplomatic intricacy, resolving such disagreements demands balancing different concerns and preferences. American military placement reflects preparation for multiple possible situations. The cargo transport increase, communication platform deployment, and naval existence all show readiness for complex contingencies. Such preparation doesn't necessarily mean specific activities are imminent. It does mean that if situations demand reactions, capabilities will be positioned to supply alternatives. Markets are calculating elevated danger into different asset divisions. Energy sector instability reflects worries about potential supply interruptions. Global equity markets display nervousness about wider economic influences. Commodity costs exhibit unusual configurations consistent with ambiguity about future conditions. When markets exhibit such clear indicators, that reflects collective evaluation from millions of participants examining available data. Market conduct supplies useful information about how professional investors and traders perceive probabilities. Current calculation implies markets assign meaningful probability to situations involving significant disruption. Whether that disruption appears through economic channels, regional circumstances, or both stays unclear. The merger of multiple schedules generates condensed decision-making periods, tariff execution. Wednesday, diplomatic meetings next week, military placement ongoing, financial markets reacting continuously. Historical configurations imply that when multiple significant circumstances happen simultaneously across economic, diplomatic, and security fields, the situation often arrives at inflection points where major choices become necessary. Those inflection points can settle through negotiated results, through unilateral activities by different entities, or through events that transform the fundamental situation. Forecasting which direction situations will pursue demands evaluating countless variables and probabilities. Current signals imply diplomatic settlement encounters significant obstacles given the distances between expressed positions. Economic actions might generate effects, but perhaps not rapidly enough to connect those diplomatic distances within available time periods. Military placement supplies governments with alternatives should they conclude situations demand reactions. Whether those alternatives get utilized depends on choices that stay unmade. The next 10 to 14 days will likely prove quite significant. Multiple schedules merge. Different entities encounter choices with significant implications. Markets are observing closely in calculation and elevated ambiguity. For observers attempting to comprehend these circumstances, concentrate on concrete signals rather than language. Observe what nations execute with military placement. Track whether tariff executions advance as planned. Monitor diplomatic meeting results. Those concrete activities and results will disclose more than public declarations about intentions and choices. In complex situations involving major powers, activities communicate more clearly than language. The situation stays fluid. Results aren't prearranged, but current paths imply that significant circumstances are approaching rather than staying distant prospects. How those circumstances develop will depend on choices that leaders execute during this condensed schedule.